Hey, everybody, this is Nathan at MountainSeed. We're going to give everybody another 30 seconds to jump on the line, and then we'll get started. All right, we're going to get started. This is Nathan at MountainSeed. I'm the president here. It is my pleasure to introduce Andy Reisser, who serves as our compliance director. In the past, Andy's held multiple roles within the appraisal side, being a staff appraiser, review appraiser, manager on the production side, and most recently, before joining MountainSeed, as manager of compliance for a large public company, JV, involving one of the largest private mortgage lenders in the country. And one of Andy's main responsibilities with us is to head compliance, which includes training our non-appraisal staff on USPAP. So we've adapted this presentation that he's done internally for external consumption, and I know that everybody's going to enjoy it. So without further ado, Andy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nathan. Great introduction. I appreciate it. Probably no need to follow up anymore. So we'll just kind of jump right in here. This is USPAP the basics, and I want to stress the basics. This is a very basic overview. In the roughly 30 to 45 minutes when I'll be talking to you, I'm really not going to get into a whole lot of depth and detail of what's in USPAP. It's basically an overview as to what it contains and what those things that it contains are and how they relate. But, typical course for USPAP introductory is a 15-hour course for appraisers, and then the update itself is 7. So we'll move it along here. So content, what is USPAP? Why is it important to you? I'm assuming that everyone on the line here is not an appraiser. If you are an appraiser, prepare to be deathly bored because you should, I'm sure you know everything that's already here. We'll talk a little about what it is, what USPAP is, the name of it, what the letters stand for, why I think we all need to be familiar with this. And then we'll just do an overview of the USPAP, which includes taking a look at the rules, standards, advisory opinions, and frequently asked questions. Rules we're probably going to spend most of the time on because as we're not practitioners who are in the room, the standards may be somewhat important, but as non-practitioners in our dealings with appraisers, we really want to focus on the rules, and you'll see why. And then toward the end, we'll go over some frequently asked questions that come from USPAP and other sources if we have time. I'd rather take questions from the house if there are questions, if not frequently asked questions. And we do have a PDF copy that can be circulated. I think Melanie will have that circulated if anybody wants it by request, or I think she might just send it to everybody or to be available online. It's my Wheaton Terrier, Daryl. So he's my icebreaker. So I can go over the mundane, boring things. This is a broadcast, so everybody's phone should probably be muted. We're going to try to save questions till the end so we can get through all the material. And usually as questions come along, we're probably going to deal with them later on anyway. I want to just quick disclaimer that this is not a formal or official USPAP course, and I am not acting as a formal or USPAP instructor. And all of the opinions and conclusions included in this presentation are mine and mine alone and not my employer's. So quick disclaimers, we'll move along. So USPAP stands for Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. I'm hoping everyone knows that or has heard that before, but I've heard some pretty comical translations of the mnemonic. So USPAP is Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. What is it? It's a lot of things, but for the most part, it's a document that addresses ethical and performance obligations of appraisers, provides definition, rules, standards rules. I say that's a common basis for comparisons. Basically, It allows us to use common words, common language, common rules to follow. It's very general and very basic, but it allows everyone to have that common reference source, both practitioners, users of services such as yourselves, and the public, as well as enforcement and regulatory agencies can also use this as a document for reference, and clients, other intended users, public, etc. So it's really, that's the point of having the document itself. We'll get to the point of what's actually in the document here in a second. So what's the point of USPAP? This slide that I have up right now and these 5 things I put up here, the point of USPAP is, and you'll hear reiterated from many people in the words public trust, express purpose to promote and maintain a high level of public trust as well as confidence in professional appraisal practice. Before USPAP, there was not necessarily a common way for anyone to trust it. Like you might be a member of a professional organization or something along those lines, but if there was no common standard by which everyone follows, you might not know what it is, or that you're getting the excuse me, product at the end might not be what you were thinking. So that concept of trust really obligates the appraiser to act in the public interest. And these 5 things will be always kind of running through anything an appraiser does, which is independence, impartiality, objectivity, competency, and integrity. And I mean, I think the only oddball in there is kind of competency, which we'll get to in standards. But these 4, independence, impartiality, objectivity, and integrity, 4 out of the 5 are dealt with in the rules, which is why I said we're probably going to look at we're probably going to look at the rules mostly today and not necessarily standards, because that has more to do with the competency. But when you think about USPAP, think about these 5 basic things like independent, impartial, objective, competent, and act with integrity. That's an appraiser's job. And that's what USPAP sets out to do. Very basic, very general. And again, that concept of public trust is found right in the USPAP preamble. Again, promote and maintain that high level of public trust in appraisal practice by establishing requirements for appraisers. It's essential that the appraisers develop and communicate their analyses, opinions, conclusions to intended users in a manner that is meaningful and not misleading. Anybody who works with me hears me repeat many of these words over and over again, almost to the brink of annoyance, but it really is important to get back to these basic principles when we're talking about appraisal, because ultimately we need that independence, objectivity, integrity, competency, etc. All right, so who writes USPAP? I'm sure that you've heard that comes from all over the place, that it's the government, but that's not true. The Appraisal Standards Board, which is within the Appraisal Foundation, writes and promulgates USPAP for appraisers and other appraisal services. So when I say it's not the government, the Appraisal Standards Board is part of the Appraisal Foundation. We won't get too deep in this because it gets confusing even to appraisal practitioners. The Appraisal Standards Board is part of the Appraisal Foundation. The Appraisal Foundation is not a government agency, even though it is a government-sponsored foundation. It's not part of government, so they don't write laws or anything along those lines. It's something that's been mandated. So, the Appraisal Standards Board writes it. They publish a new version every 2 years. Typically, there are edits and changes, and the most recent version is 2018-2019, so it just became effective this past January, and will be good until December 31st of 2019. I'm sorry, and so as of January 1st, 2020, a new one will become effective. Usually, a new edition will be published sometime around September, October of the previous year, and you can start taking coursework, but it doesn't become effective until the first of the year. So public acceptance of USPAP, and what I mean by public acceptance is why USPAP? Why select this document versus some other document to define what appraisers are supposed to do and how they're supposed to do their work with ethically and competently. So again, the Appraisal Foundation and the Appraisal Standards Board responsible for writing it are not government entities with power to make, judge, or enforce laws. They write the USPAP because it's been mandated by the federal government that there has to be some standard, fairly related transactions, for appraisal. So this has been written, it's been agreed upon, Congress contributed to it, identifying as the generally recognized standard practice in the appraisal profession. Title 11 of FIREA provides recognition and authorized federal finance agencies to use USPAP in their regulations. It's also kind of responsible for the appraisal subcommittee, which we won't talk about today necessarily. So USPAP has been basically, we could call it sanctioned by the federal government in a number of ways and reference a number of laws, so that USPAP is that document that is expected to be, those standards that are expected to be followed when using appraisal services for federally rated transactions. So that's why we use it. So the important part here, why is this important to you? When I say you, I'm thinking most people on this call, on this webinar, are lending professionals of some sort who are not appraisers, right? They might consume appraisal services, they might have interactions with appraisers, but are not appraisers. So I'm writing this as to why is this important to you as a non-appraiser. And you know, there's a lot of reasons, but I tried to simplify this. As a lending professional, it's important to have the basic understanding of the profession that we're working with and the requirements that appraisers must conform to. Common sense, because it's going to affect how we do our jobs, or you do your job as a professional who deals with appraisers. The information that appraisers convey to lenders can often be critical to lenders' decision-making process. So if it's critical to that decision-making process, you want to be able to make sure that you're understanding what you get as a user of appraisal service. It's important that appraisers provide an unbiased and competently developed opinion of value so the lender can make a sound lending decision. Again, unbiased and competently developed, right? So you want to make sure the appraiser is acting independently and not in anyone else's interest, and that is competently developed, because if not, if there's influence on the value opinion or any opinion, or it's not competent, the accuracy and reliability of that opinion is compromised. As an appraisal management company, we have to ensure the product we provide to lender client will fulfill their needs, as well as federal appraisal guidelines, AMC laws that require compliance with USPAP. So we, as an AMC, have to follow state laws and that apply to AMCs. Many lenders do not. However, there are federal guidelines and federal laws that require, if you're using an appraisal, that it comply with USPAP, and this is, the appraiser must comply with USPAP. So from the time it's procured, to the time it's reviewed, to the time it's lent on, every part of the appraisal process should comply with USPAP by federal law, or that appraisal is not in compliance. So we'll talk about that when we get to the rules, and that just the document, piece of paper itself, appraisal report, is not just that has to comply with USPAP, but the whole process from procurement of the appraisal to the review to the putting in the loan file has to all, somewhere using that appraiser, has to follow USPAP. And that's where the rules are going to come in, because it's all that impartiality, objectivity, independence, and integrity. Along those lines, the integrity and independence, et cetera, lenders and AMCs cannot require an appraiser to do anything that would violate USPAP. So this is important, right? I've heard it said before through some banking professionals and other non-appraisers that, well, USPAP doesn't apply to me. I don't have to follow it. I can say and do whatever I want. To an extent, that's true. USPAP doesn't apply to lending professionals, but if you're dealing with an appraiser in a transaction that is regulated, trying to influence or require an appraiser in any way to violate USPAP would put that particular transaction in jeopardy, because it is not acceptable to require an appraiser to do anything that would violate USPAP. And again, repeat myself, but lenders are required by federal regulations to use appraisals that were developed and reported in compliance with USPAP. And again, in addition to federal regulations, AMCs are also subject to state regulation, which are often more restrictive. We'll talk about a couple of instances later on in this presentation about instances where AMC laws that apply to management companies are more restrictive than USPAP. There are currently 46 states with active AMC laws. Soon to be 51, which is all 50 states plus the District of Columbia seem to be opting in. Some just have an extension until the end of 2019. To our knowledge, all territories have opted out. Virgin Islands is questionable, and anyone can opt in at any time to the AMC laws. But right now, there's 46 different state laws that we are subject to, and they're not all the same. All right, more responsibilities lender MC. So when we're working with appraisers, we cannot require appraisers to accept any assignment if they cannot complete an appraisal that conforms to USPAP, if they're not competent to complete the assignment, if the time allowed does not afford the appraiser to the ability to meet their legal and professional obligations, if the lender's requirements for the scope of the assignment are too narrow to provide credible results, or if the assignment requires them to make statements that are not true and or hypothetical conditions or extraordinary assumptions that are not appropriate. Again, big red letters at the bottom. We're not allowed to, it almost goes without saying, we're not allowed to alter an appraiser's report. But if you look at this list of things, in here, for our responsibilities, for the most part, it's not really about the content of the appraisal, right? It's the person, the appraiser we select, and how we work with that appraiser and how that appraiser goes about doing their job. Again, this is nothing to do with standards as to what goes in the report and the development, but really just who's doing it, how you select this person, who does the selection, and what goes into actually getting someone to do the job, the right person for the right job. And again, there's some exceptions in here that we'll get to where USPAP may allow someone who's not competent at the time of assignment to accept it, but we'll talk about that in a little bit with AMC laws where it exceeds USPAP to an extent. All right, so that's kind of a highlight of responsibilities that AMCs and lenders have in working with appraisers, and kind of that even though USPAP applies to professional appraisal practice, we're not really allowed to do anything that would put an appraiser in a position where they would have to violate USPAP to meet one of our requirements. This slide, it kind of out of place. I didn't know where to put it in there, so I put it in there. Why it's important to us, the USPAP, but why it's important in general is that there are enforcement agencies that enforce USPAP. Typically, USPAP is enforced at the state level through state appraiser boards. States do licensing. They license appraisers, and then they require that appraisers follow USPAP. And then if appraisers are found to have violated USPAP, they would do an investigation and enforce USPAP at the state law level. To my knowledge, there is no federal USPAP police or appraisal. There's no federal appraisal board or USPAP police or any type of enforcement. The appraisal subcommittee is part of the FFIEC, and they maintain the registry of licensed appraisers, and they provide the federal oversight of the state licensing agencies. So they make sure that the state licensing agencies are doing their job by enforcing USPAP. So appraisal subcommittee enforces to states, states enforce to the appraisers, and that's where it goes. All right, so we kind of looked at our responsibilities as to what it is, like what we're supposed to do, and now we're just going to take a look at what's in USPAP. And again, I don't want to get too into detail. Again, it's not necessarily part of what we need to do, as any non-appraiser needs to do, is to memorize definitions or preamble or rules or any standards, especially standards, but just to get a general idea as to what really does USPAP do and how does it dictate how appraisers do their job, and then how does that affect us. And I kind of started with how it affects us, and now we'll kind of see, I think you'll see some parallels as to what the rules and the standards say, and how they apply to appraisers, and hopefully it'll make some sense. So we'll start with the ethics rule. Ethics rule sets forth requirements for integrity, impartiality, objectivity, independent judgment, and ethical conduct. It's broken down into 3 sections. So I'm going to kind of pause there and just remind you, and we'll look at this again in a second, but the integrity, impartiality, objectivity, independent judgment, if you remember back to that slide, what's the point of USPAP? Those 4 out of 5 things, they come up pretty quickly in the ethics rule when you get into USPAP. So the first rule in USPAP, and it's probably the most important. It's broken down into 3 sections: conduct, management, and confidentiality. We'll talk about those in a little bit of detail, but conduct is impartiality, management is disclosure of basically any interest you might have in an assignment, and confidentiality is obvious, protect the confidential nature of the appraiser-client relationship. Like I said before, Think about the ethics rule to go back to what's the point of USPAP and the things in the preamble. And, appraiser must always act with independence, impartiality, objectivity, competency, and integrity. So this is the very first thing in USPAP is this. This is the most important thing, right? It comes first. It's dealt with up front. This is important, and then we move on from there. So look at the ethics rule, and the first section is the conduct section. Basically, the conduct section is mostly so I always say that the conduct section is, I think, the only part of USPAP that really has prohibitions in it, what an appraiser must not do. But, it says positively that an appraiser must perform, again, impartiality, objectivity, independence without accommodation of personal interests. So that means an appraiser cannot perform an assignment with bias, right? They can't be biased in any way. They're supposed to be impartial. Cannot advocate the cause or interest of any party or issue. This is an important point and how I usually bring it up is that some folks who are not appraisers might see appraisers more like an attorney, where they're out to fight for their clients or advocate for their client's cause, but it's actually quite the opposite, is that they are not there to advocate for their client's cause. They're there to give the client an impartial, objective opinion, and then the client uses that opinion to go and do with it what they need for their cause. It's kind of a subtle difference, but not really. And trying to understand that that nuance is very important. That advocating the cause of an interested party or issue. Appraisers must not accept an assignment with predetermined opinions or conclusions. Should not misrepresent the role of providing valuation services outside of appraisal practice. I'll unpack that one a little bit, the misrepresentation of role. For example, you may have a certified residential appraiser who is an underwriter, right? And they work for a bank, a lender, even insurance as an underwriter. And they wouldn't be considered to be doing an appraisal, so they wouldn't be subject to every part of USPAP. But because they're licensed appraisers, they can't misrepresent their role. They're providing a valuation service. It's not an appraisal, but still they can't call them, they should not be holding themselves out as saying, hey, I'm a certified residential appraiser and this is my appraisal opinion. They should be basically say, I'm acting as an underwriter and that's what I do, I'm wearing my underwriter hat. Appraiser must also not communicate or allow to be communicated assignment results that are misleading or fraudulent. Must not use or rely on unsupported conclusions relating to categories such as race, color, religion, gender, marital, family status, income, handicap, etc. Must not engage in criminal conduct. It almost seems like redundancy when it's called the ethics rule, but must not violate the record-keeping rule. It must not perform an assignment in grossly negligent manner. So anytime an appraiser does any of these things, it could be considered to be in violation of USPAP. So without even writing a report, just doing any of these things could demonstrate non-compliance with USPAP. And to be honest, when something goes to state boards complaints, they're far more sensitive to issues that violate ethics rules than they are to issues that might violate standards, which is what's actually in the report, because you can make a mistake in a report that's an honest mistake. But if you're making mistakes in reports that were intentional or based on bias or incompetence or some sort of criminal conduct or fraud, that's a big difference, right? Fortunately, talking to FDIC and FBI investigators, 95% approximately of what looks like fraud is usually just incompetence. I don't know if that's a good news or bad news. So it's not necessarily that people are out to defraud the public on purpose. It just happens because they're not very good or very competent at their particular job at the time. Moving on with the conduct section. Sorry about the loud red here, but there's one part of the conduct section I said there'd be some exceptions to USPAP where some state laws might exceed, AMC laws might exceed, or even federal laws, what's in USPAP. So if known prior to accepting an assignment and or discovered anytime during the assignment, an appraiser must tell the client that both before acceptance, any time at it, and in the certification that they have any prospective interest in the subject property or parties involved, right? So you notice I put in red down below that we cannot allow this. So due to the nature of the assignments that we manage, our underlying clients must adhere to independent laws and regulations that exceed those set forth in USPAP. So while USPAP says, as long as you notify your client that you might have some prospective interest, right? You might have discovered in the middle of it, you have prospective interest. That could be a number of things that you might want to buy this property, that your brother-in-law owns it, that your mother is the buyer or the seller, something along those lines. If you have interest in that, USPAP does allow you to disclose. However, we mostly, those of us who work in federally related transactions and loans and any type of mortgage lending at all, all the federal regulations around this and state AMC laws as well most of them exceed USPAP in saying you cannot have any interest in a transaction. If an appraiser has any current or prospective interest in the subject property, transaction, or parties involved, we instruct them at the time of engagement to stop the assignment and notify us immediately. Right. So the management section of the ethics rule. Appraiser must disclose if he or she has paid a fee or commission or given a thing of value in connection with procurement of an assignment. This is basically, you cannot have a compensation arrangement for an assignment that is contingent on anything such as predetermined results, any direction in assignment results that favors the cause of the client, the amount of value opinion, the attainment of a stipulated result, or the occurrence of a subsequent event directly related to the appraiser's opinions specific to the assignment's purpose. So typically just refer to this as contingent assignments, right? Assignments contingent upon some outcome. This is not okay. I know it was common practice about 15 or 20 years ago to engage in, I don't know how common it was, but it happened a lot, to engage in a practice called comp checks, right? You would get an appraiser would get a fax and say, do not appraise unless it's worth $315,000, which, again, that's a predetermined result or direction in assignment. You're accepting an assignment or have a compensation or assignment for an arrangement based on a stipulation or an attainment of stipulated result. Same with payment, right? Just acceptance of the assignment alone would not be okay. But if someone says, well, I'll pay you more if you make it worth more, or I'll pay you more if you make it worth less, right? If you're in a divorce or something where somebody may want the value to be lower. You can't accept an assignment based on an outcome. You can't accept a fee based on an outcome, right? And just some additional things about the management section. You can't advertise or solicit assignments in a manner that is false, misleading, or exaggerated. You must affix or authorize the use of a signature to certify recognition and acceptance of USPAP. And you can use appraiser may authorize the use of his or her signature only on an assignment by assignment basis. So you can have an assistant or a secretary or someone else apply yours, even if it is a digital signature to an appraisal, but you can't give someone unlimited access, unfettered access to your signature. It has to be on an assignment by assignment basis that you give permission. And again, an appraiser must not affix the signature of another appraiser without his consent. Almost common sense, right? You can't sign somebody else's work for them. All right, last section of the ethics rules, confidentiality section. Appraiser must protect the confidential nature of the appraiser-client relationship, act in good faith in regard to legitimate interests of the client, and be aware of and comply with all confidentiality and privacy laws. It's kind of common sense, but an appraiser really should only disclose confidential information or assignment results to no one but the client, parties specifically authorized by the client, state regulatory agencies, parties authorized by due process of law, or authorized professional peer review committees. So, we'll get this in frequently asked questions, but appraiser works on an assignment for a client and completes the assignment. That client is done, and the client being the lender doesn't want, they don't want to go through with the loan. The borrower may have walked. Borrower goes to another lender and now wants the appraiser to give the appraisal to that client. It's not acceptable, right? I mean, that's not your client. That's confidential information. Those are assignment results. The appraiser is not permitted to hand over information to the client, and I would argue that it's unethical for someone to ask the appraiser to hand it over because they're asking them to violate USPAP. And finally, next would be the record-keeping rule. So we're moving off the ethics rule and going to the record-keeping rule. I spend a whole lot of time on the record-keeping rule. Basically, all the record-keeping rule says is that appraiser must maintain a work file that can basically document all of the information that was provided in a report. Competency rule, more big red letters. So I think we talked about this being one of those big 5 things, right? I mean, impartiality, this was kind of the oddball: impartiality, objectivity, integrity, and independence. Well, here's competency, right? This falls into one of the rules. Appraiser must be competent to perform an assignment or acquire the necessary competency to perform the assignment or decline or withdraw. So notice that I went to number 2, the acquire the necessary competency. So acquiring competency, USPAP allows an appraiser to disclose, I don't currently have the competency, but I'm able to acquire it by working with this person or by learning this thing, and then they disclose it. We can't allow this. There are state AMC laws that exceed USPAP, and our engagement letter specifically instructs appraisers to decline any assignment they are not competent to complete at the time of engagement. I should actually continue that statement and say any time in the assignment they find that they're not competent to complete something, should also withdraw from the assignment at that time or decline it. So we can't allow that because state AMC laws tell us that we should not be assigning to anyone who at the time of engagement is not competent to accept the appraisal assignment. Scope of work rule. This is pretty basic, however, very important, because what really determines what's going to be in an appraisal is the scope of work, right? We have to determine what the problem to be solved is, determine and perform the scope of work necessary to develop credible assignment results, and then disclose that scope of work in the report. So what really drives what an appraiser is going to do in an appraisal report is that initial determination of what's the problem to be solved, what's our appraisal problem, and what do I have to do to get a credible assignment results. So one thing is, somebody asks, well, what's USPAP all about when it comes to the standards? And we'll get to the standards later. It's like, well, basically the standards have some basic things you have to put in a report, but USPAP, when it comes to completing an appraisal, really comes to me to the scope of work rule. Once you're past all the ethical stuff, scope of work rule is tell us what you're going to do to solve, tell us what the problem is and what you're going to do to solve it, and then do it and show it to me in the report. Do it competently and credibly. And that's what the scope of rule basically says. Identify the problem, tell us what you're going to do, and then do it, and then tell us you did it in the report. Not going to get into jurisdictional exception rule too deep here. Just quickly, jurisdictional exception rule basically states that if following USPAP in a certain jurisdiction, typically a state or a locality, if following USPAP would cause you to violate a law in that jurisdiction, you can deviate from USPAP. However, I've heard people use the jurisdictional exception rule but not do it correctly, is that you still have to cite in the report the law or regulation that requires the exception to USPAP clearly and conspicuously, and basically let the reader know, like, hey, I couldn't follow USPAP here because it would violate this state law. The state law says this, and here's what I did to not follow USPAP and follow state law. So I've read in reports reviewed before that, and it's, well, we didn't follow it because it's because we don't have to, because the state law tells us we don't have to, and then there was no citation, and we actually did get to the state law. The state law didn't say what they said it said, so it gets kind of ugly, but we'll move on. So wrapping up the rules here, again, I think if you looked at the ethics rule and the management rule, the competency rule, all of these things really fall back into, and I repeat this slide a couple of times throughout here, and I do this in all my training for non-appraisers in our organization, is that independence, impartiality, objectivity, competency, integrity is really, those are the basic principles behind USPAP. I'm going to move on to standards here in a second. Standards, again, we're going to go briefly through these, but the standards and standards rules, we're actually only going to look at 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we're just going to give a brief definition as to what they are. We're not really going to dig into them because they get detailed, and then we get into definitions and concepts and all these things. Just kind of get a general idea of what they are. The reason we're only going to do 1, 2, 3, and 4 is because they really only apply to real property appraisals. 5 and 6 are mass appraisals. 7 and 8 are personal property, and 9 and 10 are business or intangible assets. We do some of these things, but for the most part, most people are looking at standards 1 through 4. The reviews, the appraisals, and the reviews that we typically procure fall into these categories. So 1 and 2 being development and communication of real property appraisals. Standard 1 is development, standard 2 is reporting, and then 3 and 4 are development and communication of an appraisal review, which is, and again, 3 is development, 4 is reporting. So standard 1. Standard 1 states that in developing a real property appraisal, an appraiser must identify the problem to be solved, determine the scope of work necessary to solve the problem, and correctly complete the research and analysis necessary to produce a credible appraisal. Sounds like I just repeated myself in what I said when I was talking about the scope of work rule, right? Because it's tell us what the problem is, do the research, report it correctly, and give us a credible appraisal. It's really the main thing. That's what an appraiser's job is. That's what an appraisal is meant to do. Without getting into detail, it's just tell us what you're going to do it, and show us, right? Standard 1 is directed toward the substantive aspects of developing an appraisal. The requirements in Standard 1 follow the development process and the order of topics addressed and can be used by appraisers as kind of a convenient checklist. So it's basically like, hey, here's this number of things you have to do, right? You have to have this. It has to identify the client. It has to do. You have to do this research. You have to develop an opinion of market value. If you do, you have to do these other things. It's almost like a checklist, right? It doesn't say specifically you have to do a certain type of inspection or a certain type of report, but it's like for the problem that you're solving, have a relevant scope of work, right? Solve the problem, correctly complete the research analyses necessary to meet that scope of work, and then complete the credible appraisal. Well, Standard 2 then says once you do all the work, you have to report it in a credible manner. So we go to Standard 2. In reporting the results of a real property appraisal, you must communicate the analysis, opinion, inclusion, and conclusions in a manner that's not misleading, right? I think we talked about this beginning, meaningful and not misleading. So it addresses the content and level information required in a report that communicates the results of an appraisal. So Standard 1, I'll go just kind of back up real quick, says develop it. In order to get the research and analyses, you have to do these certain things. Standard 2 says in order to communicate it to an intended user or reader, client, you have to have a minimum of these things. It doesn't list them all, right? But there's a minimum number of things. It doesn't dictate form, format, or style of the report, right? There's 1004s, there's 1073s, there's narratives, there's this, there's that. There's 2 types of report formats, but reporting styles, but that's it. The form, format, and style of report are functions of the needs of the users and the appraisers, and the content of the report determines its compliance. What form number it's on or how it was done doesn't really matter. It's compliance with USPAP. It's really what the content is. And basically, what Standard 2 says is you have to give the client or the reader, the intended user, enough information in your report and detailed analysis to show them that you followed Standard 1, right? The development made sense and was credible. And we move on to Standard 3. Standard 3 is kind of a repeat of what Standard 1 said, but it's in the review, right? Or instead of developing an actual, the appraisal report, this is an appraisal review assignment, but you'll see that the language is very much the same, if not exact. Identify the problem to be solved, determine the scope of work necessary to solve the problem, correctly complete research and analyses necessary to produce a credible appraisal review. And again, Standard 3 is development. You have to get that scope of work necessary to solve the problem, do the research, etc. And Standard 4 says, how do you communicate it in a report? So again, it's kind of repeating what Standard 2 said with appraisals. It's just appraisal review. Appraiser must communicate each analysis, opinion, and conclusion in a manner that is not misleading. Same language, it's just for an appraisal review and not an appraisal. And again, does not dictate style, form, format, or appraisal review reports. Those things are functions of the needs of the intended user and the appraisers. All right, so I said there's 2 different ways to report defined value opinions per USPAP. There's 2 different types of reports. There's one called an appraisal report, and there's one called a restricted appraisal report. That's in the current version of USPAP. It appears that in the new version of USPAP that to come out in 2020, there's going to be a move toward there just being one reporting format, right? An appraisal report. And then the contents of that is going to be determined by the use of the intended user, or the needs of the intended user, and requirements placed on the appraiser to competently, credibly report assignment results. So, but currently, let's go to appraisal report, is summarizes data analysis used in the assignment. A restricted appraisal report typically just states conclusions of the appraisal. So this isn't 100% true. I know if there's anybody out there who's technically inclined in USPAP, there's some places where you only have to state things in an appraisal report and you have to summarize things in restricted. But in general, that's the difference between these two reporting formats. Appraisal report is a little more detailed. It has summaries. Restricted report itself is a little less detailed, and it states the conclusions in appraisals. But it should be noted that the development of the results for these reports is the same. Like, just because in a restricted appraisal report you only state conclusions, how you got to those conclusions has to be as credible and as diligent as those assignment results that you would get as an appraisal report that summarizes. The level of information in the report does not dictate the level of research that goes into creating them, if that makes sense. It's just the reporting format allows you to shorten it up for specific purposes. So I'm going to go back to it again. What's the point of USPAP, right? We've pretty much made our way through all of what actually would be considered USPAP. So I don't know if anyone's ever seen the book. It's a spiral binder. It goes about, it's about the thickness of a men's leather belt. And we'll get to advisory opinions and frequently asked questions. But standards 1 through 5 in that book, that's about the thickness of a men's leather belt. The thickness of the actual USPAP, what we just went through, ethics and standards, that is really considered to be USPAP, is roughly about the thickness of a small cat's flea collar, right? So about the width of a pinky finger. So it's about, I would call it 1/8 of the whole spiral bound book, not including index, etc. So again, that independence, impartiality, objectivity, competency, and integrity is part of USPAP. It's really just a general way that everyone has to do business. So I call them USPAP advisory opinions, and we're going to talk about frequently asked questions too. They are attached to those sections of USPAP, which is the rules and the standards, but they're not really officially part of USPAP. It's more of a form of guidance. So advisory opinions take questions or major issues, usually for enforcement and regulatory agencies, some common issues that come up, and offer guidance like, hey, if this issue were to come up, here's how we typically think about it. But it's not considered to be an official interpretation. Seems almost counterintuitive, I know, but not considered to be an official interpretation, and they're based on presumed conditions without any investigation or real verification of the actual circumstances. So it's hypothetical. If this thing comes up, here's kind of how we would see it and what parts of USPAP they feel would apply. So it gives guidance on how not only for practitioners to do things, but how for regulatory agencies and lenders to do things. They don't establish new standards or interpret existing standards. It's just, like I can repeat, just guidance, but it can be helpful, especially for laypersons who don't, non-appraisers who don't really use the standards, et cetera. There might be something that, hey, there's an issue and, we want to figure out, let's take, for example, I think the most recent one published in 2018-2019 was number 37, which is on computer-assisted valuation tools. And it allows you to understand kind of what should we expect to be in a computer-assisted valuation tool when it's coming from an appraiser. What kind of minimum requirements? What applies here? So it helps appraisers, help regulators, and it could help lenders also understand that. And then let's move frequently asked questions. Frequently asked questions is another large, thick section of USPAP. Again, very helpful for appraisers and non-appraisers alike, because there's questions in there. It's like, hey, can I do this? And if we don't have too many questions in the house, we'll actually look at a couple of these frequently asked questions. But hey, this thing came up. I had a client call me and ask me to readdress an appraisal. Can I do that? And it'll give an answer, yes or no, and then explain why. And it's not always as black and white as yes or no. But again, much like advisory opinions, USPAP frequently asked questions are not considered to be part of USPAP, even though they're attached for help to understand USPAP. USPAP is the rules and the standards, etc., not advisory opinions or frequently asked questions. They don't establish new standards. They don't interpret existing ones. Again, this just illustrates applicability in specific hypothetical situations and offers advice from the Appraisal Standards Board for resolution of some of these problems and issues. Again, they typically stress that it's not the only possible solution. It's just one way of looking at it. You know, there's always going to be probably 100 different right ways to look at it, but it at least offers you a chance to get a glimpse as to what they think the writers and publishers of USPAP think would be relevant. So we're coming up on about 45 minutes. So I'm going to, Nathan, I don't know if you want to take, see if there's any questions. That's Daryl again. He's out of breath, just like me. It was one of our fall walks. So let's see if anybody's got any questions.
Thanks, Andy. Why don't you do this? I know you mentioned going through a couple of the FAQs. Let me just, we'll collect. I don't think there's been any, but just to give people a couple minutes, if you could just maybe run through one of the FAQs like you mentioned, and then we'll just, if anything comes in the next couple minutes, we'll funnel it over to you.
Sure can. All right. Well, here's actually the FAQ that I just kind of use it as a example. But so the question, this comes in a lot. I'm the client. May I request the appraiser transfer the report to another party? I think we discussed this before, and no. Once the report has been prepared for named clients, the appraiser is not permitted under step to redress or transfer the report to another party who is not the client. And the applicable part of USPAP here would be the confidentiality rule, right? It's prepared for a client. Sharing assignment results or reports with someone who's not the client is a violation of USPAP. Could the appraiser complete another assignment for a different client on the same property? Absolutely. But it's a new assignment, new scope of work, new effective date, new client, everything's new. They can't just take one name off and slap on another. Next question is very similar.
Great.
Copy of an appraisal performed for another client. I'd like to ask the appraiser some questions about this appraisal. Does USPAP prohibit the appraiser from discussing the appraisal with me? Again, yes, it does prohibit it. We're back to the confidentiality rule. Communicating assignment results or confidential information to anyone other than the client, party specifically authorized by the client, is prohibited. So if you have an appraisal that was not prepared for you as the client and you call up an appraiser, be prepared for the appraiser to say, sorry, I can't talk to you. It's just not acceptable per USPAP.
Hey, Andy, we are getting several questions about USPAP and evaluations under the interagency guidelines, and particularly whether 2020, the next edition of USPAP, and you may not know offhand, but if there are any planned changes to USPAP to deal with evaluations. But I think it might also be helpful, and just, we don't have much time, but just kind of the 2 or 3 minute summary about kind of evaluations as they relate to USPAP and state law and federal law, and just kind of a quick overview of kind of who's in charge when it comes to evaluations, maybe appraisers versus non-appraisers. I think some sort of just general overview there would probably be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a good question as far as relation to evaluation. So let me say that USPAP, two ways to look at this. First, let's say if an evaluation in almost every state, if an evaluation is completed by an appraiser, it is going to be an appraisal report of some sort. It's going to be an appraisal report, either that restricted appraisal report or just appraisal report. It's either going to be one of the two. So USPAP is still going to apply 100%. Now, in addition to what USPAP says about development, et cetera, evaluations, which are typically regulated by the Interagency Appraisal and Evaluation Guidelines, there are additional things that have to be in there that per the Interagency Appraisal and Evaluation Guidelines. So those, and I believe at our last count, myself and our chief appraiser, Rob McPherson, we came up with, we believe, 9 things that should be added on there, that should be part of the requirements for the appraisal. but it doesn't change the appraiser's responsibilities to follow USPAP. It doesn't lower it. It actually increases it. So they have to follow a USPAP in whichever reporting form they use. A lot of times it's that restricted use of report, but it doesn't have to be. And then they also have to follow what's already in their agency guidelines. I don't think that there'll be any changes in the 2020 to address evaluations. There might just be some opinions, advisory opinions or frequently asked questions. There's already an advisory opinion that does relate to this. And off the top of my head, I always forget the number of it. But I do believe there's an advisory opinion already. I want to say that it's 30, but not positive. So advisory opinion 30. So that's a question I could probably get back and have mailed out. But the answer is, I don't believe there's going to be need or want to change anything in USPAP to deal with evaluations, because if it's done by an appraiser, they still have obligations to follow USPAP. They just might have to exceed those to also include the requirements for an evaluation that are in place in the Interagency Appraisal and Evaluation Guidelines.
That's great. And Andy, I mean, it is true, right, that to the extent that there is a battleground here about pending policy changes, it would be at the individual state level, and it would more than likely deal with whether the appraiser has to comply with USPAP as a starting point for completing evaluation. So my understanding, and Andy, you can confirm, having, for everybody's benefit, I know Andy's participated with some states in the drafting of some proposed legislation, and so I'm certainly not the expert here, but my understanding is that there are some states that have made some waves about coming out with some specific exemptions where they may say, hey, appraisers don't have to comply with USPAP when performing evaluations. Any thoughts on that front, Andy?
Yeah, then that's going to be on a state-by-state basis, and that's a conversation and argument going on right now. Some from the Appraisal Institute are if everybody can mute their phones, please. Some from the Appraisal Institute are arguing for it. Some states are arguing for this. So there's a possibility that that appraisers could opt out of conforming to USPAP to complete evaluation assignments in some states. Possibility. Some states, I believe, already allowed it to an extent. I haven't read any laws that I believe do that the intent's not there. But there are other states that have rules currently in the making that are and possibly will be passing. I think Texas is one of those states that's looking to allowing appraisers to opt out of USPAP if they're doing an evaluation assignment. But at the same time, they would still have to follow interagency and appraisal and evaluation guidelines to make sure they are. So that's a good question, Nathan. So I don't know that wouldn't change USPAP, right? That wouldn't change USPAP. That would just change state laws, and that would have to be done on a state-by-state basis because, again, states are the licensing authority that govern and regulate the appraisers themselves. So if a state says you don't have to follow USPAP if you're not doing an assignment that requires following of USPAP, then so be it. And kind of a further note that with some of these state questions about states starting to change it, federal government's also looking at changing. I've heard, I don't know if it's for a fact, but it seems to be rumored that if states go in one direction, the federal government might go in the other direction and say, well, we're going to require USPAP compliance for evaluations also. That's neither here nor there. I don't know that to be a fact, but it's been rumored. So it could go a number of ways. But my answer to the question, I think, Nathan, is that it's not going to change USPAP. It's going to change state laws and possibly federal laws as to who has to follow USPAP. The USPAP itself won't change based on that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A quick
and
note,
that's probably outside
the advisory opinion. Yes. Oh, sorry. The advisory opinion, if anybody wants to look it up, is advisory opinion 13 deals directly with evaluations that are compliant with USPAP.
Thanks, Andy. Hey, one other question that we got in deals with sharing the purchase price with appraisers. So, Andy, obviously, I know it's typical practice to provide a sales contract with a purchase price. So there's some questions about how that relates to, steering the value or the independence of the appraiser. So, any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's actually part of it actually is part of development of the appraisal, that if there's a current or prospective or past offering on a property, or it's currently under contract, that has to be disclosed in the appraisal and analyzed. So like if there's a current contract and the appraiser knows of it, you're supposed to, the lender or borrower or realtor, but through the lender, somehow the appraiser is supposed to get a copy of that contract, because per USPAP, they have to analyze that contract, right, and analyze the purchase price, et cetera. Same with any sale in the last 3 years, typically, so, of the property. Does that make sense? So well, sharing it does not, if it's a purchase, sharing that contract does not violate USPAP. As a matter of fact, the appraiser is required in the regular course of business to procure that contract as part of the assignment.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions we have, Andy. I appreciate your time today and everybody joining the call. One question that often comes up is about slides. I think generally speaking, the best practice, just respond to the email invite that you got for this. If you need the slides, we can get those to you, or reach out to anybody at MountainSeed if you have an account manager or know someone here, and we can get you the slides. Thanks everybody for joining.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Nathan.